Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is the next episode in the Reflections on the Quran of a Layman. Inshallah, today I wanted to discuss a very fascinating verse in Surah Al-Qasas, which is chapter 28 of the Quran, verse 7. Surah Al-Qasas, as many of you know, is very unique that it is, like Surah Yusuf, a chapter that primarily focuses on the life story of a single prophet. And in the case of Surah Al-Qasas, it focuses on the story of Musa alayhi salam. Now, in verse 7, Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وأوهينا إلى أم موسى أن أرضيه فإذا خفت عليه فألقيه في اليم ولا تخافي ولا تحزني إن رأدوه إليك وجاعلوه من المرسلين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this verse that through wahi, he told Ummi Musa, the mother of Musa, four things, four commandments. Ardayihi, breastfeed him. Number 2, فَإِذَا خِفْتِ عَلَيْهِ فَأَلْقِيهِ فِي الْيَمِّ. If you are scared, then cast him into the river. لَا تَخَافِ, don't be scared. لَا تَحْزَنِ, don't be concerned or worried. So these are four commandments that Allah says to Ummi Musa, and then he says that he is going to return Musa to her, and that he will make Musa from one of his messengers, Mursaleen. Now, generally speaking, when you read or about this verse and the tafasir, most people focus on the kind of second commandment, right? Alqihi fil yam, cast him into the river. But if you analyze these four commandments, actually a different picture emerges, right? So if you look at the last two commandments, La takhafi wa la tahzani, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gives Ummi Musa reasons. He says, don't be scared, don't be worried, because I am going to return him to you. So he's given reasons for why she should do this. Similarly, when you look at the commandment to cast him into the river, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say, just cast him. Allah says, if you are scared for his safety, cast him. So it isn't a kind of unconditional commandment. It is a conditional commandment. In particular, if you read the Bible, if you read the Old Testament, where we read the story of Moses in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22, we see that actually the order to cast newborns, the Hebrew boys or the Israelite boys, into the river was actually a commandment from the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh said, boys should be thrown into the river, the girls should be kept. This was the Pharaoh's commandment because the Pharaoh was scared that he's going to be brought down by one of the Israelite boys. So actually the commandment to throw boys into the river was not Allah's commandment. It was actually the commandment of Fir'aun. Allahu Alam. And in this verse, Allah is telling Ummi Musa, فَإِذَا خِفْتِ عَلَيْهِ, right? In other words, if you are scared of him or scared for him, then you are okay to cast him into the river. So the last three commandments, Allah is actually giving reasons to Ummi Musa. The first one, an ardihi, breastfeed him, he doesn't give any rationale. Allah doesn't say breastfeed him because of this, because of that. He doesn't say breastfeed him because it's nutritious, right? He doesn't say breastfeed him because he's going to like the taste. He just says breastfeed him. It's a commandment directly from Allah, and he doesn't tell the mother of Musa why she should do this. Now, we find out the wisdom of this breastfeeding later on. We will talk about it. But to me, when I read this verse, it's clear that the focus is actually on breastfeeding. It is through breastfeeding that Musa ultimately gets returned to Ummi Musa. In fact, if you read the a few verses down in verse 12, Allah says, وَحَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِ. Right? Basically, he made haram on Musa all the other milk that the women had, because we find that when Musa ended up in the palace of the Pharaoh and the wife of the Pharaoh was trying to figure out how to feed this child, she called a lot of women, but Musa refused to suckle, and it was finally only Ummi Musa's Musa's milk that he was willing to drink. So that relationship that was formed between Musa and his mother through the breastfeeding is the vehicle through which Allah is able to return Musa to Ummi Musa. Now, he doesn't tell Ummi Musa all of these secrets, but we find therefore that, one of the big lessons, I think, major lessons that we can derive from this verse is sometimes we don't necessarily know the reasons behind Allah's commandments, right? Allah's Sharia. Sometimes we can justify it through kind of utilitarianism or some other logic. But if you think about breast milk, well, formula is available, and maybe formula is more nutritious, right? There are some commandments like that in the Sharia that we don't necessarily know exactly why Allah wants us to do this. We avoid pork. There are a lot of people in the world who eat pork, right? It's not that they're all dying. It's not that Muslims have longer lifespans. It isn't that beef doesn't give you heart disease. It does. So we avoid pork because Allah said it, and we know that there's wisdom behind it. And I think this verse is an indication that sometimes Allah's commandments have wisdom that He doesn't necessarily tell us. He doesn't necessarily share with us, but we have to believe and accept that there is, in fact, divine wisdom. And in fact, in this case, Allah's promise to return Musa alayhi salam to Ummi Musa was fulfilled through this act of breastfeeding. The second thing that we learn from this verse is, of course, the importance of breastfeeding itself, right? In the Quran, in many places, Allah talks about the importance of breastfeeding. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 233, Allah talks about the 2 years that a woman is allowed to breastfeed her child, right? Hawlaini kamilaini, if she can. In other verses, for example, in chapter 22, verse 2, Allah talks about how the day of judgment, when He's trying to describe the kind of the scariness of the day of judgment, He says even women that are breastfeeding their child will drop the child and run away, right? يَوْمَ تَرَوْنَهَا تَذْهَلُ كُلُّ مُرْضِيَةٍ عَمَّا أَرْضَعَتْ. Even the women that are breastfeeding, right? So breastfeeding is such an important act. And in the Sharia, we know, as well as in the Quran, that Allah establishes that breastfeeding creates an inedible, a kind of a irreversible relationship between the woman and the child. So, for example, in Surah An-Nisa, verse 23, when Allah is talking about the kind of women that a man is not allowed to marry, one of them is our foster sisters. So if you have a foster sister, maybe she wasn't from the same mother, but if she drank milk from the same woman as you, you're not allowed to marry her. So clearly, throughout the Quran, we see A, the importance of breastfeeding, B, the divine wisdom behind it, and C, the fact that this breastfeeding creates an indelible relationship between the mother and the child, right? The second lesson, I think most important lesson perhaps that we can get from this verse is that in the modern world especially, many of us, we tend to sacrifice the time that we spend with our children. We're all working so hard, we want to make money, and we do this a lot of times because we want our children to have a better life. We want them to have financial security. We want to make sure that we can pay for their college, for their high school, private school, whatever it might be. And in doing so, we oftentimes ignore spending time with them. We spend more time with our colleagues. We spend more time working than we do with our own children. And I think this verse is an ishara that there is a deep bond that gets developed between a child and the mother and the parents in general that you cannot replace, right? This isn't a relationship that you can create later on in life. If you don't invest time, if you don't invest being with them physically as a mother or a father, it will be very difficult, perhaps impossible, to recreate that really strong relationship with their children. And this really made me think because, oftentimes I, like everybody else, work very hard in order to create a good future for my children. But then I ask myself, am I doing it really for my children? Am I doing it really to make sure that I have a great relationship? Or am I doing it because of my own ego, because I want to have a big house, nice cars, and I want to show off? Allahu alam, but I think this is an important wake-up call for us, especially in the modern world, because sometimes we think that we are making the right choices. We think that we are sacrificing, time that we spend with our children for their sake. But then that could backfire, and in fact, it might end up creating a broken relationship with parents, right? And we know of many stories where if the parents are absent, if the mother and the father are not there to provide physical comfort to their children, the children simply don't develop that relationship, because children are very simple. They take signals from the environment. If the person is there in front of them, they know that they're dependent on them, and they develop that love and dependency. If that person isn't there, then they figure out how to live without them, and then it's very difficult to later on in life sort of recreate that kind of dependency. So I think that this verse is very important for me. Number one, to establish the importance of breastfeeding. There might be other options like formula, and in some cases, a woman may not be able to produce milk, but to the extent possible, breast milk is this verse is indicating the importance of it. Number two, this verse indicates that Allah's commandments, sometimes He gives us rationale, sometimes He doesn't. In this verse, we see 4 commandments. Allah gave 3 commandments with reasons, but 1 commandment to breastfeed, He didn't give Ummi Musa any reasons. But the reason was hidden, and it was in fact because she breastfed him that Musa alayhi salam returns to her. The third thing is, I think, a very important lesson for all of us that are parents today, that we recognize that while we have to work hard and work for the financial security of our families and our children's future, we cannot completely ignore the need the children have to spend time with us. Because if we don't, that time isn't coming back. Wallahu alam. وآخر الدعواني أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Please leave your comments and criticisms in the comment section. Thank you again for watching.